Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the newly released Gran Turismo 7 and see what exactly it does differently, both technically and from a gameplay perspective, to the previous entry to the series, Gran Turismo Sport. For this analysis, both games are being played on the PlayStation 5, outputting on a 4K display, with the visual settings set to their quality presets whenever possible. Though I do feel it's important to note that these settings largely impact the quality of the replay videos and photo mode options. So while I will show close-ups of the vehicles and track elements using these modes, I'll also be sure to show actual gameplay sequences throughout to help give you a better sense of what the game will look like across the board. Alright, so let's kick this comparison off by first taking a look at some car models, starting with the Ferrari 458 Italia. Just like with Gran Turismo Sport, the vehicle models in Gran Turismo 7 are nothing short of remarkable. There is an insane attention to detail to every available vehicle, with an exceptionally high poly count and a near-flawless color accuracy for each factory paint job. Ferrari Reds, for example, appear the exact right tone of red that you'd expect from the real thing, and this is brought out even more so with an appropriate HDR display. Then there's all the small details like the Ferrari insignia, the headlamps and taillights, the wheel hubs, and the beautifully decorated interiors that are not just retained but enhanced further thanks to a native 4K output as opposed to the checkerboarded 1800p used before. With this big bump to the resolution, you can expect a much cleaner, sharper presentation overall, greatly reducing the poor aliasing along its vehicles, an issue that plagued GT Sport. GT7 also benefits from much more realistic reflective surfaces for its vehicles as well, with higher resolution cube maps used for the in-game models, and more sophisticated ray tracing techniques in any of the game's available photo or replay modes. Next, let's take a look at the environments. One of the weaker visual elements of GT Sport's presentation was without a doubt its environmental design. Iconic courses like Brands Hatch and Mount Panorama, while faithful to their real-life counterparts as far as the track goes, lacked the level of detail necessary to make these locations feel believable. The texture maps for necessities like the tarmac, road stripes, dirt, and grass were all low-res by today's standards, and quickly fall apart under close scrutiny. While the trees closest to the edge of the track were acceptable thanks to a smart use of multiple sprites per branch, the layer of 2D trees in the backdrop is easy to spot due to the lack of proper shadowing. Gran Turismo 7 doesn't necessarily improve everything across the board here. All pre-existing tracks built to be used in GT Sport have most definitely been recycled back into Gran Turismo 7, and you can tell a lot of the same assets have been recycled as well. But there have been a number of nice improvements all throughout that help transform these environments into something more tangible. Almost all of the textures, for example, have been updated with higher res variants, most notably this dirt texture used on the opposite side of this track barrier. Vegetation has also been beefed up considerably, with more 3D tree models being used to fill in the backdrops, and appropriate shadowing being applied at further distances to create the illusion of a dense tree line. There's even new grass sprites added to all of the grass terrain on each track, which helps a great deal in giving Gran Turismo's world a more fleshed out appearance. This is helped even more by GT7's largely increased draw distances, which really get a chance to shine in some of the more original GT tracks, with vast distant valleys offering some of the most scenic locations to drive alongside. Pedestrians have similarly been given a bit of an update, with a bunch of new animated sprites being added to the crowd to bulk up the character diversity, along with a few new 3D model characters that, while not necessarily amazing, look to be a step up from what we had before. Collectively, Gran Turismo 7's tracks are a solid step in the right direction, and offer improvements in the areas that needed them most. Though it's understandably still not mind-blowing either, with even some of the most nicely decorated courses feeling like they're a couple years behind. Thankfully, the lighting does do a nice enough job distracting from these shortcomings, with some gorgeous true-to-life color tones and dynamic time of day options available for practically every track. It's almost identical to the lighting rig used in GT Sport, but the improved reflections I mentioned earlier do make a drastic difference for the cars themselves, whether in-game or when watching higher quality replays. The reflective cube and sphere maps have all been enhanced as you can see here, displaying higher quality replications of the surrounding environment. In replays, these reflections are mostly replaced with ray trace reflections instead, which can accurately project images of off-screen elements like other cars, trees, and even environmental decor. It's a very demanding effect, and so whenever this ray tracing is active, the game drops its frame rate to a locked 30 FPS instead, though players do have the option to swap to a performance mode, effectively disabling ray tracing altogether. However, I did find that environmental reflections in-game do feel like a slight step back, as these roads, even with the heaviest rain options and water accumulation on the road surface itself, seems to make more use of specular lighting effects rather than the screen space reflections. Though my guess is that this is a result of pooled water now having an actual direct impact on the gameplay in GT7, which I'll discuss more in a bit. As for the actual ambient lighting, something about GT7 still feels weirdly off. Volumetric lighting feels noticeably absent, regardless of the time of day or weather conditions, and bloom effects, for some odd reason, feel overly exaggerated in GT7, making rows of cars or reflective material alongside the track blindingly bright at certain angles, something that didn't occur nearly as often, if at all, in GT Sport. Next, we have shadows. Despite using the exact same time of day settings in these races, I found that often the shadows in GT7 are much sharper than those found in GT Sport. Vehicle shadows are now razor sharp, with every silhouetted detail being displayed on the pavement, whereas in GT Sport, there was a great deal of softening added to these edges, often accompanied by some fairly apparent shimmer and artifacting. Environmental shadows of objects further from the shadow's projection also appear sharper, like this tree here, where tree leaves are almost being projected perfectly on the road's surface, whereas in GT Sport, they appeared much softer and were arguably more realistic before. But like with the car shadows, these tree shadows in GT Sport were often plagued with a lot of artifacting, as different quality versions would pop in and out of existence as the player drove by. A problem that does not seem to plague GT7 nearly as much, with only a few major exceptions. Night shadows cast by the player's car in dark races have also been redone, casting large dark shadows dynamically depending on the player's headlight direction and the object blocking them. It's at times a nice looking effect, but some of that same unnatural dithering still occurs, mixed with the fact that the shadow seems to completely negate the AI's own headlights, so there's definitely plenty of room for improvement. Moving on, we have effects. Unfortunately, Gran Turismo 7 still does not offer the sort of realistic damage models I would have hoped for. But it's important to note that this is more than likely a licensing issue with using these real-life vehicle brands, rather than a failure on the developer's part. Vehicles can still be damaged, but the cosmetic appearance of even the most severe crash is easy to miss, with only tiny fender dents and cracked headlights. What's odd though is that the great looking particles that kick up from driving over loose gravel and sand has been greatly reduced this time around, with only stationary particle effects appearing in the vehicle's wake rather than kicking up like before. It's a weird drop in quality, though my guess is that this might just be a bug, as other particle-based effects like rain have seen a major improvement. Not only is heavy torrential rainfall represented with significantly more particles on screen in Gran Turismo 7, but the water itself will now pool realistically along the surface of the road, and will relentlessly cause cars to hydroplane and largely impede vehicle control. Rain wasn't even technically featured in GT Sport when it first released, and was added later with the title update, so it's great to see GT7 come out of the gate with this feature not only available from the get-go, but enhanced a great deal. Mix that together with the improved reflections and specular lighting, and rainy nighttime races like this one really pop out on the screen to deliver something impressive. Adding to this is Gran Turismo 7's excellent use of the DualSense's adaptive triggers, which feels much better than the standard rumble effects used in Gran Turismo Sport. Every type of road surface will feel different, with rumble strips, bridge junctions, and every small impact with other cars being appropriately reflected in either trigger depending on which side of the car is affected. I've played quite a few PS5 games now, many that make liberal use of these triggers with mixed results, but GT7's incorporation is probably one of the best so far, and is one of the better new features on offer with this game. Another benefit GT7 sees, thanks to the new hardware, is the exceptionally sped up loading times that can last between only 2 or 4 seconds, as opposed to the 10 to 20 seconds we saw with GT Sport. It's a hugely welcome change, especially considering how often Gran Turismo requires players to flip between menu pages, though I do wish that Polyphony had found ways to streamline the menus a bit more, and let players swap cars or open roulette rewards from the user menu bar at the top, rather than requiring additional loading time just to visit the proper menu page. Another important distinction with GT7 over its predecessor is its available game modes and menus. GT Sport was a weird game when it released back in 2017. It never really felt like a mainline entry to the series, which is evident by its naming convention, and seemed to lean more heavily towards supporting its online competitive atmosphere, as opposed to its traditional single-player campaign. The game did eventually get a rudimentary campaign, with a long list of races to cross off a checklist, but it still never quite felt right. GT7, however, is the full package, with all the great multiplayer elements that fans loved about GT Sport, along with a complete racing career mode right out of the box. The career involves collecting cars using easy-to-follow menu books given to the player at the central cafe hub. With these menus, players must then participate in races around the world, each featuring different car manufacturers and brands, all while earning necessary licenses, competing in championships, and carefully tuning vehicles with a robust vehicle modification menu. The main world map screen is somewhat convoluted, as most Gran Turismo games have a tendency to be, but thanks to a decent pace and an unmistakable passion for automotive history, the game is just a joy to play through, and never feels quite as monotonous as padding through GT Sport's available single-player offerings. My only complaint with the layout is that the arcade mode is weirdly integrated into the career mode menus, so trying to set up a quick race with any owned vehicle requires that you visit a location submenu, and then select the optional race options at the bottom. Gran Turismo Sport's menus were simply more intuitive here, with the modes listed clearly right at the top via drop-down menus. If GT7 could integrate something similar, while retaining its semi-immersive campaign world map, then I think we could have the best of both worlds. For players interested in the cars themselves, Gran Turismo 7 also sees a big increase to its starting lineup, with over 424 cars available at launch, as opposed to the 168 cars in GT Sport. However, that number is a bit misleading, as a lot of GT7's cars are unique racing variants of pre-existing cars in the lineup, and Gran Turismo Sport did eventually up the total car list to 324 through updates. GT7 also offers way more tracks for players to race these cars on. At launch, GT7 offers 34 different tracks to race across, with 97 different layouts between them all. Gran Turismo Sport, by comparison, only offered 29 tracks at first, and only ever managed to get to 82 total configurations by the end. Finally, let's wrap up with a brief sound comparison. Which game do you feel offers the superior audio quality and design? And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Gran Turismo 7 is the GT game that I personally have been waiting years for. It takes everything that worked in GT Sport and improves upon it, with a sizable bump to its visual quality, while also reintroducing gameplay elements that fans have been asking for. There's still room for improvement, as the game still has a rather stale appearance in many instances. But I genuinely found myself having a lot of fun playing through this game's career mode, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this game progresses in the future. But what do you guys think? Are you impressed with Gran Turismo 7? Or do you still prefer the look and feel of Gran Turismo Sport instead? Let me know in the comment section. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this posted every week.